Tang Tang, standing at her side, snapped back, firmly refusing the diminutive label, turning the moment from a tactical note into a human spat. The exchange revealed loyalties and blame as much as it revealed where the injured now lay. Captain Jai Yaetang remained propped on the bed, a wounded anchor to the shifting logic of command, while the others absorbed the implication of who had borne them home. The fragile order in the infirmary, already unsettled by discoveries about who held the walls and who had been carried back, hardened into a moment of pointed accusation and uneasy revelation. The red-haired second captain moved in like a blade made casual, calling out to Tang Tang in a tone that landed on the room as both summons and challenge. Nearby, 3 recruits registered the name with stunned, silenced faces that betrayed how personal the charge had become. Tang Tang, who had bristled when blame hovered earlier, found herself centered by that attention, as onlookers absorbed the implication that she might have been responsible for the evacuation. Before arguments could sharpen, an unfamiliar dark-haired officer leaned in and stated, almost offhand, that they had been found outside a cave, an unexpected fact that reframed the entire recovery as retrieval rather than a planned extraction. The revelation stretched the moment thin, leaving loyalties and logistics equally unsettled. After the infirmary's brittle accusations and the unexpected detail that the group had been found outside a cave, the scene tightened into a quieter accounting. A seated officer spoke in a clipped, factual voice, informing the assembled that they had all been unconscious. The panel cut to a slope where multiple bodies lay sprawled and still, the wind and dust catching the edges of their forms. A blonde figure lingered at the edge of the wreckage, as the speaker added that the one-finned demon had not been present, and that its absence had turned a near-impossible recovery into a risky but achievable retrieval. The revelation reframed the earlier tension. This was not an orderly extraction, but a hurried salvage after an ambush, and the missing demon, whether predator or expedient absence, became the quiet pivot on which blame, relief, and lingering unease now turned. The aftermath remained taut. After officers described how the group had been found unconscious outside the cave and a blonde figure lingered at the wreckage, the scene narrowed to an infirmary interrogation. The second captain leaned over the protagonist's bed and stated that 3 of the others awoke first, but none could recall the cave. She emphasized that he alone had been in a coma and showed significant changes, and urged him to think carefully about what he remembered. She offered him a small mirror. When he looked, the reflected light caught a pale streak through his hair and the unnatural clarity of his eyes. The protagonist registered the altered feature, and the name Tomo flashed in his thoughts, a small, visible mark that turned the medical report into a personal clue about whatever had touched him in the cave and why the retrieval had been so fraught. After the mirror revealed the pale streak in his hair and the fleeting name Tomo, the protagonist sank further into his own thoughts and tried to assemble what remained of the night in the cave. In quick, jagged flashes, he relived an attack, a sudden blow, collapsing into darkness, and the staccato image of fallen figures and blood-slick ground where he had been struck. He could only firmly recall losing consciousness during that assault. The sequence of events that followed remained hazy and dislocated, as if someone had edited the film of that night. The uncertainty widened into a moral dilemma. Facing the officers who were questioning him, he weighed whether to disclose every truth, including the impossible knowledge that he had been reincarnated. Torn between secrecy and the burden of altered identity, he lingered on the question, the room pressing in as those images faded and the decision loomed. The protagonist narrowed his gaze and folded the option of confession away as too risky. He judged that admitting the impossible would invite disbelief and unwanted scrutiny. Instead, he decided to take on Aang's identity as a tactical cover, planning to move under that name to uncover the truth. Close-up on his golden eye and trembling hand matched the urgency of the choice. Secrecy would be his instrument rather than revelation. He then recounted the few concrete beats he could trust. He had briefly come to in a cave, and that fleeting awareness had been enough to tell him where they had been taken. After that, darkness swallowed him again. The memory ended with him regaining consciousness only later in a hospital bed, the intervening hours blank. Still haunted by the mirror's earlier hints and the name Tomo, he kept his silence and readied himself to act as Aang until he could piece the night back together. After deciding to wear Aang's name as a mask and keep the truth lodged beneath his silence, the protagonist lingered on small certainties and the gaps between them. He studied the lines of his face and the cold light in his eye, doubting whether he was exaggerating the fear that someone else might have been unconscious as well. The thought led him back to that cramped subterranean chamber. He had wandered deeper, felt the world tilt, and then reached a ledge where something dark spattered across a cavern wall. He had stepped forward to touch it, searching for explanation in motion and texture, but the memory frayed at the edges and collapsed into blankness again. Still haunted by the mirror's intimations and the echo of the name Tomo, he folded the cave's image under his plans, sharper and more watchful for whatever trace might lead him back to the missing hours. A jagged memory of splattered blood surfaced and unsettled him, but the protagonist could not fill the blank where the rest of the scene should have been. In a sunlit clinical room, he settled onto a rolling stool opposite the injured man and asked a simple question: was his name Aang? The answer hung small and ordinary against the larger strangeness. The protagonist observed that Aang shared his name with an incredible warrior, a remark that felt both like an attempt at connection and a probe for meaning. He slumped back, watchful and tired, letting the mundane exchange and the lingering image of blood coexist, each tugging at different corners of the missing hours he could not yet reclaim. The protagonist had already been haunted by a jagged memory of splattered blood and the blank hours that followed, and he kept to a cautious rhythm as he settled beside the injured recruit. He spoke plainly about the results of Aang's tests, a weak foundation, but an unexpected calm when faced with demons. Watching Aang closely, he asked whether the man had ever actually fought a demon. Aang protested that he had not. He claimed only an academic hunger to fight, a compulsion to catalog and analyze demonic weaknesses rather than first-hand experience. Two observers lingered at the foot of the bed, their silhouettes and quiet attention making the room feel like an evaluation rather than a bedside conversation. The exchange folded ordinary small talk into probing questions, and the protagonist, tired and watchful, let Aang's confident denials sit uneasily against the persistent, blood-smeared fragment of memory he could not resolve. The protagonist had kept a cautious, quiet rhythm alongside the injured recruit, the jagged memory of blood still pricking at the edges of his attention when the assessment shifted into view. Two observers loomed at the foot of the bed, one red-haired and amused, the other broad and authoritative, and they lined in like examiners weighing a specimen. They teased that he seemed the theory type, and, smiling, urged Tang Tang to cultivate such a splendid warrior. The suggestion snagged at him. The word warrior landed loud against his bruised composure, sparking something like disbelief and longing at once. For a breath he stared upward, then his face broke into sudden, fevered eagerness as he demanded to know his test results, pressing for concrete numbers to justify the hope they'd just suggested. The room's evaluation tone shifted into a thin, electric anticipation as the protagonist's question hung between them. The charged silence that had followed the protagonist's demand for concrete results broke into bright, direct news. A pink-haired recruit declared, with infectious glee, that the warrior test had been passed and that the group was still a team. The announcement landed like sunlight in the evaluation room, answering the protagonist's urgent question and turning fragile hope into tangible confirmation. Lower in the room, Captain Jai Yaetang explained that the pairing was not accidental. He had made them a team, and the mood shifted from tentative to practical as the leaders framed the future. They singled out Aang by name and said they would be relying on him from now on, converting the informal congratulation into an assignment of trust. The moment sealed a new beginning. What had been an anxious assessment became a compact of expectation and responsibility, leaving the recruits buoyed but aware that tests had only just begun. A pregnant silence settled across the room before the white-haired recruit spoke, her voice quiet but clear as she stated that, compared to the other teams, they were already behind. Her words cut through the respite like a new alarm. the group's earlier lift in spirits dimmed as the implications sank in. The protagonist looked up, attentive and probing, asking aloud whether they had truly fallen behind the other teams. The exchange narrowed the scene to two faces, one outlining a sober observation, the other measuring the claim for consequence and response. No solutions were offered in that instant. Instead, the moment crystallized the shift from celebration to assessment. Both recruits held a fragile resolve in the face of the admission, and the room lingered on the question of how quickly they could close the gap before the next test demanded results. After the team's brief assessment had shifted the room from celebration to sober planning, the blonde commander stepped forward and delivered a blunt administrative blow. Teams earned points by passing missions, and because the protagonist had been unconscious for 3 days, their team stood at 0. The protagonist sat up in the hospital bed, startled and incredulous, his single-word reply punctuating the cramped silence. The moment didn't stay contained. A frantic, almost comical shout about the 3-day coma ripped outward and reverberated off the nearby buildings, turning private bad news into a public jolt. The exchange hardened the earlier worry into an immediate obstacle they had to overcome. The recruits' fragile resolve was tested anew as the city itself seemed to amplify their setback. After the humiliating tally and the city's echo of their failure, the scene narrowed to a charged interior where a pale, long-haired figure stood with their back to the room, turning like a signal that something official had arrived. The camera cut to hands and details. A shadowed, masked challenger smoothed a collar and flexed gloved fingers, the motions deliberate and precise. Nearby, the pink recruit crouched and tightened their stance and footwear, as if answering an unspoken cue. The masked figure then crossed their arms with a thin, confident smile, the gesture folding the small rituals into readiness. The air had shifted from embarrassment to provocation. The recruits' earlier setback now met with a stark demonstration of poise and intent, setting a palpable tension that promised an immediate test of skill and nerve. Civilians craned their necks and murmured when a cluster of newcomers stepped into view, one voice shouting that it was Captain Jai Yaetang. The crowd noticed the recruits, youth, and the caption noted they had gathered only 3 days earlier. The camera panned down to the steady advance of boots, and then to a rigid line of trainees standing at attention. The pink recruit and other hopefuls folded into the formation. A masked figure and a blonde officer stood before them, the assembly tightening as the official raised a hand and promised to explain the rules. The masked presenter's tone cut the chatter, formal and unmistakable, as they offered congratulations and prepared the recruits for whatever test lay ahead, leaving the audience and those in the line suspended between relief and apprehension. The masked presenter stepped forward and announced that the assembled trainees had officially become warriors, his voice cutting across the city noise as aircraft and rooftops framed the recruits below. The camera pulled back to show 4 figures, each standing tall in their new uniforms, beneath a pale sky, while onlookers craned their necks from the streets. As the scene tightened on the recruits' profiles, the presenter commended them for being able to return safely after facing a one-finned demon, his praise carrying weightier implications than ceremony alone. The pink recruit and the dark-haired protagonist exchanged steady gazes with the horizon, while the white-haired trainee watched impassively. Each expression registered a mix of relief, pride, and the quiet gravity of survival. For a moment, the city seemed to hold its breath, acknowledging both the achievement of rank and the thin line that still separated these new warriors from the dangers beyond. After the masked presenter's formal applause faded, the blonde commander took the foreground and informed the 4 recruits that they had been grouped as a single team under his care. He framed himself as the captain responsible for their welfare and added that, among his charge of 9 teams, he hoped this quartet would stand out. His face filled the panel with firm authority as he set expectations. Then the protagonist, eyes steady, asked what it meant to stand out, a quiet, puzzled challenge that revealed the gap between ceremony and consequence. Narrative boxes closed the scene by explaining the shifting rites of passage. Becoming a warrior now required navigating new, complicated rules, whereas before a recruit's rank and identity had been forged immediately through battlefield kills. The moment felt equal parts command and inscrutable promise, leaving the recruits to measure duty against a changing code. The blonde commander's earlier pronouncements still lingered as the recruits clustered and traded quiet questions. One of them leaned toward Aang and asked if he had heard of the small team point ranking, a term that cut through the murmur and forced the protagonist to echo it aloud in puzzlement. A pale-haired recruit stepped forward with a cool, dismissive tone, scolding them as naive and announcing that their quartet sat at the bottom of the standings. The revelation landed heavily, faces tightened, and a sharp internal warning, "Don't drag me down," flashed from one recruit, underscoring how brittle camaraderie had become under the new rules. The exchange turned ceremony into immediate consequence, as ranking and reputation reshaped the recruits' expectations and raised the stakes for every choice they would now make. After the recruits' low murmurs died down, the blonde commander stepped forward and pointed at a tall, empty leaderboard while laying out the mechanics of the small team point rankings. He told them that because he oversaw 9 teams, each squad would be measured against 8 others, and that points would be earned by completing missions. Higher-level missions produced more points and thus raised a team's standing. He explained that every month the subordinates of the 3 captains would be ranked, and that the 2 teams with the most points, along with 6 additional small teams, would enter a dedicated small team competition with prizes for first place. Shadowed silhouettes of commanding figures framed his words, turning the abstract chart into an immediate personal pressure. Recruits listened as the administrative rules hardened into incentives and punishments that would steer alliances, choices, and reputations going forward. The blonde commander stepped into view as a tall silhouette and addressed the gathered recruits, laying down a punitive rule: every captain's last-place team would be punished. He announced that those teams would be demoted to the cleaning crew, and that they would have to wait until the second month before the next cohort of last-place teams arrived, making the penalty both public and prolonged. The scene shifted down to the punished recruits, who were shown scrubbing streets and washing surfaces in protective gear as the new status took hold. Close-ups captured the physical labor and the small, resentful sigh of a recruit who found the work inconvenient, turning an administrative decree into immediate daily hardship for those who had failed to earn points. The commander's words had hardened rankings into consequences, and the city's cleanliness became a visible reminder of the stakes. The blonde commander stepped forward and laid out the rules for the gathered warriors, stressing that breakthroughs would come only through competition and that the demons kept evolving, so they could not afford to relax. A small cadre of recruits and city cleaners remained visible in the background as the commander framed the stakes in stark, administrative terms. From a low-angle seat, Chiliu stood with hands behind their back as the announcer named them team leader for having the highest test points, the title presented as both reward and responsibility. The protagonist watched the exchange with a measured expression as the commander swept the crowd with a final, confirmatory question: were they all fine with that? The moment left the group poised between order and pressure, leadership assigned, expectations set, and the necessity of competition underscored against the city's sunlit blocks. Voices rose in quick succession as the assembled recruits offered no protest to the decision to back Liu. One speaker vouched for her meticulousness while another praised her strength, and their agreement closed the matter without further debate. The mood shifted sharply when Aang burst out in furious objection, demanding to know why he had not been chosen, and railing that he had been humanity's strongest warrior in a past life, a self-styled king who could not accept his weaker, reincarnated self. The contrast between the calm, almost administrative assent of the others and Aang's petulant, grandiose tantrum left the group poised on a knife edge of rivalry and reluctant order, the recruit's steady endorsement of Liu set against one recruit's wounded pride and unresolved fantasies of former glory. After the recruits had closed ranks and Aang's indignant outburst had hung in the air, one recruit moved to the forefront with decisive steps that punctuated the room. She rose onto full view, eyes bright and voice hard, and declared that they would definitely complete their mission, projecting certainty over any lingering doubt. Her stance was unapologetically proud, hands behind her back, chest forward, the pendant at her throat catching the light, and she let loose a self-satisfied laugh, openly claiming the team leader's mantle and reveling in the choice the group had made. The moment sharpened the group's direction. Where uncertainty and rivalry had threatened to fracture them, her bold assertion reasserted a single course of action, turning personal bravado into an anchoring declaration for the assembled recruits. After one recruit's brazen declaration had settled the group's course, the party moved out beneath a bright, unforgiving sky. The blonde commander walked ahead, his stride decisive as he called back that it was still afternoon and they should use the remaining hours to choose a mission. He instructed them to study the other small team's points as well, casting the decision back onto the recruits while offering a clear deadline. The formation broke subtly, shoulders squared and postures aligning with the earlier assertion of leadership. The recruits filed after him and spread through the plaza to gather information and make plans. The sunlight flashed off the city's high facades as they dispersed, an ordinary, ordered transition from rhetoric to action, with each face carrying the weight of a choice now theirs to make. The blonde commander closed the briefing with practical orders, reminding the recruits that their nano-wing battlesuits would only be mastered in real engagements, and that any issues should be reported to him directly. His profile cut into shadow as he spoke, then he stamped the session closed with a single, authoritative dismissal. The recruits snapped to attention and responded in unison before turning away. The commander walked ahead, shoulders squared, his back to the plaza as silhouettes spilled forward around him. The cadence of footsteps and the flash of sunlight off the city facades marked the transition from instruction to action, a shift from talk to movement that left decisions and uncertainties scattered among the departing ranks. As they dispersed to study other teams and choose missions, the commander's parting offer hung in the air, a tether for those unsure of their next step, and a reminder that leadership would remain accessible amid the looming challenges. After the blonde commander dismissed the briefing and the ranks began to disperse, a small team drifted toward the mission board with brisk, practical talk about making up lost ground. They reminded each other that real proficiency came from active missions and that their team already trailed others by 3 days in points. Footsteps and casual strategies gave way to a startled halt when a pink-haired recruit suddenly shouted for everyone to wait, cutting through the conversation with urgent insistence. The group spun back as the camera closed in on a white-haired recruit whose expression had hardened. She interrupted the routine scramble for assignments to insist there was a more important matter they had to resolve first, turning the moment from mundane logistics into a tense pivot that demanded immediate attention from the team. After the white-haired recruit had halted the group's routine and demanded attention, the protagonist's expression tightened, and her thoughts spilled out in frantic self-questioning about forgotten responsibilities and the damage to her image as a leader. She replayed possibilities, team positions, supplements, and instant regrets about assuming command, and the panel showed her escalating anxiety in jagged, breathless thoughts. That fragile spiral broke when the pink recruit stepped forward with a bright, disarming grin and a camera in hand, announcing they should simply take the team's first official photo. The sudden, almost childish proposal shifted the mood from exposed worry to an oddly grounding human moment. The recruit's cheerful insistence and the camera's presence offered a simple, corrective action that both diffused the protagonist's panic and redirected the group's attention toward something concrete and unthreatening. The group's fragile tension gave way when the pink-haired recruit, eyes sparkling and camera raised, offered a simple remedy, a team photo. The protagonist's raw anxiety, already fraying from doubts about leadership and responsibility, was arrested by the recruit's innocent insistence, which redirected the moment toward something ordinary and human. A different voice then framed the situation more strategically, murmuring about small teams. As a whole, shifting the focus from individual lapses to collective capability. That reframing softened the room. The final panel closed on a half-lit figure with a wry, approving grin who conceded, "Well, that's not bad," turning diffused panic into guarded optimism and binding the group briefly with an unexpected, steadying approval. After the fragile discussion, the pink-haired recruit's bright insistence on a team photo dissolved the last of their stiffness, and the group leaned together for a single frame. They crowded close, shoulders touching, faces tilted up toward the lens, and the moment registered as a crystalline click that froze exhaustion and hope in equal measure. The protagonist allowed a wary but real smile, the brash recruit beamed without restraint, and the silver-haired figure stood a little apart yet present, their cool expressions softened by the company. The photograph itself, printed and slightly askew, became a small talisman, proof that despite doubts about leadership and looming threats, they could still gather as a unit. For an instant, the room's anxiety was transmuted into camaraderie. The shared image gave them a fragile, collective resolve to face whatever came next. They moved to the rooftop, where the blonde commander sought the protagonist's read on recent events, the city spread out beneath them. The protagonist answered with a terse report. The finless demons found near the cave had apparently exploded, and inside the cave there were signs of an unknown demon's blood splattered everywhere. In the clarity of the air, he lit a cigarette, the small flame and click punctuating his words, and the conversation tightened around implications no one wanted to accept. He fixed the commander with a hard look and asked, incredulous, whether the suggestion was that the 4 kids were responsible for what the cave showed. The question hung between them like smoke, forcing the possibility into the open, even as the skyline looked on indifferent and distant. They remained on the rooftop as the city fanned out beneath them, and the blonde commander waited for the protagonist's read on the recent oddities. The protagonist answered with clipped words and a lit cigarette, the tiny flare punctuating his doubt as he asked whether the 4 kids could be responsible for what was found in the cave. He then named Aang as suspicious. His voice tightened when he explained that his nose, unusually sensitive, picked up a familiar yet unknown stink from that recruit. A shadowed image of Aang, wrapped in a red, unnatural haze, lingered between them as the accusation settled. The commander absorbed the implication, and the skyline watched without comment. Before the discussion could escalate, a lighter voice interrupted the tension. Someone chided Tang Tang for overthinking, forcing the group to momentarily fold the theory inward and carry on with guarded unease. They lingered on the rooftop above the city, where a brief, lighter moment unfurled to puncture the earlier tension. A red-haired recruit flung herself around the blonde commander and teased about team rivalries, chattering that as long as the kids returned safely everything would be fine and warning him not to lose to her team. The commander bristled and protested his seriousness, while those nearby exchanged amused looks. The protagonist took the moment at a remove, drawing on his cigarette and letting the smoke curl into the open air as he watched the banter. Conversation shifted as one of the group asked Tang Tang to keep an eye on the smoker, to report anything suspicious they might notice, folding vigilance back into the scene. Though smiles persisted, the earlier accusation that had hung between them still tugged at the edges, and the rooftop's easy noise could not completely erase the undercurrent of suspicion. They lingered on the rooftop above the city, where a lighter moment punctured the earlier tension. The red-headed second captain flung herself around the blonde commander in playful rivalry, while others watched with small, wry smiles. The protagonist remained slightly apart, cigarette between his fingers, the curl of smoke a small, private rhythm as the group folded vigilance into their banter. Someone reminded Tang Tang to keep an eye on the smoker and to report anything suspicious. When the protagonist moved down to the city center's mission board, curiosity replaced idleness. He peered up at the display and then leaned closer, noticing that 3 tasks were ranked A. Excitement pushed through his measured demeanor as he read that each A-rank mission would award 10 points, and the rooftop's easy noise slipped back into purpose. Games and jests had not erased the work that waited, and the team's uncertain camaraderie now turned toward tangible objectives. After the rooftop's brief levity and the protagonist's curiosity about the mission board, the group clustered beneath the glowing display, while the pink recruit tried to fill Aang in on how the system worked. Lan Sinuo spoke plainly about the hierarchy, suggesting the final 3 entries were likely A-rank because of their difficulty, and the white-haired recruit stood silently, taking the information in. The board flared with numbers, B equals 6, C equals 3, A equals 10, so the point gap was laid bare, and the explanation made the 10-point A missions feel instantly more valuable. The exchange shifted the circle's mood from idle banter to pragmatic calculation as they considered how those points might change their standing and choices going forward. After their rooftop levity and the group's pragmatic parsing of the mission board, the recruits clustered under the glowing display while points and ranks hung in the air. The numeric gap made A-tier missions far more tempting and far more dangerous. The masked presenter then spelled it out plainly. B and C assignments were comparatively secure, while A-rank operations frequently resulted in severe casualties. The silver-haired recruit closed his eyes, absorbed the warning, and murmured his understanding before turning toward the board. As he walked off half a step ahead of the others, he began to voice a tentative plan, leaving the rest to watch and reckon with the risk versus reward calculus. Tension threaded the group. The 10-point value of emissions had been confirmed, and the choice between safety and rapid advancement settled over them like a decision that could not be reversed. The rooftop's earlier calculations and warnings crystallized into action when a hand flung a bundle of A-rank slips against the board, each paper skittering like a dare. The silver-haired recruit, who had been weighing the odds just moments before, looked up and declared without hesitation that they should take every emission. His voice carried through the small circle and shifted the room's atmosphere from speculative to irreversible. The protagonist met the proclamation with a steady, almost amused gaze, the two of them framed against the city skyline as the implications settled over the others nearby. A rough translator note at the bottom of the board cut through the bravado, grimly reminding readers that one recruit had nearly died and that demons had advanced since their last encounter, amplifying how dangerous the choice would be. The moment closed with the group's risk versus reward question no longer theoretical, but a clear call to action.